Good afternoon and welcome to today's Queensland State Budget Address with the Treasurer, the Honourable David Janetzki. I'm Andrew Barker, CEDA's Head of Research. I'd like to start by welcoming all of you. It's great to see so many people in the room and such enthusiasm in the conversation. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet. I wish to acknowledge and show respect for elders past and present, for their custodianship of land and continuing culture and contributions that they make to our communities. And I'd also like to acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us in the room today. Can I welcome and thank today's Major Plus sponsor Plenary Group, major sponsors APA Group and Woolworths, and supporting sponsor Colin, Biggers and Paisley. Our sponsors play a vital role in enabling us to continue to deliver important events such as this. And thank you also to our members who are hosting corporate tables today. I'd like to acknowledge a number of people in the room today. Along with the Treasurer, we have the Honourable Christian Rowan MP, Assistant Minister to the Premier, the Honourable Rebecca Young, Assistant Minister to the Deputy Premier, Teresa Harding, the Mayor of Ipswich, and also several members of CEDA's State Advisory Council, so thank you for your support. At CEDA, our focus is on understanding, discussing and advocating for the critical policies needed to drive sustainable economic growth and prosperity for all Australians. So in this context, the state budget is a really important document, not just for economists like me who like to really dig into the detail, but for governments to show all aspects of the community how they are balancing the competing priorities in the period ahead. And this budget, of course, was a particularly important one, as reflected by the fantastic attendance today, as this government's first, and it gave a clearer indication of some of the key priorities of the new government around safety, around home ownership, around health, and around road and rail infrastructure. And looking a bit more broadly for a moment, this budget of course comes at a time of heightened uncertainty globally. So trade policy uncertainty is quite literally off the charts, geopolitical tensions remain high, and just this month the OECD released updated economic projections of they downgraded to less than 3% growth for this year and next, which is pretty weak in historical context and a lot weaker than we would have liked to have seen in the rebound from the pandemic. And the Reserve Bank in its latest monetary policy statement mentioned uncertainty 121 times in that document, which was twice as frequently as in the previous statement. So this all has real implications for the economic outlook for Queensland as a small open economy that has benefited considerably from global trade. And you only need to look at the effect of falling coal royalties on the budget bottom line to see how important international conditions are for Queensland's economy and fiscal position. As elsewhere, Queensland has experienced weak productivity growth, which means government revenue doesn't get the free kick that you get when you are doing more with less. And as we've discussed at previous CEDA events, it's been great to see the reinstatement of the Queensland Productivity Commission to build the evidence base for better policy to boost productivity. And all of this is important context from the budget that we're here to talk about today, as it means it's increasingly important to be on a sustainable fiscal footing in order to react to future challenges. So this needs to be done alongside the need for strong investment in infrastructure to accommodate, move, educate and maintain the health of a growing population that we have in Queensland, as well as to prepare for the 2032 Games. At CEDA, we believe that governments need brave and deliberate policies to support and facilitate the long-term private investment and innovation necessary to support sustainable growth, consistent with our Progress 2050 agenda goals for both a strong economy and a strong social compact. So I really look forward to hearing the Treasurer's thoughts on how the Queensland Government is approaching this balance and preparing for the many challenges ahead in this, his first budget address for CEDA. I know we're in for a really interesting conversation. So for all of you today in the room, I'd encourage you to join the audience Q&A via Pigeonhole. You can use the passcode QLD Budget 25. The details will be on the screen in a moment. Or you can also scan the QR codes on your tables. And also with the QR codes on your tables, you can see who else is in the room, and I'd encourage you to do that and to join the conversation on social media. And thank you also for members of the media in attendance today for your engagement with this event. So the format for today is first Darren Rogers, Group Executive Energy Solutions at APA Group, will introduce Treasurer Janetzki and invite him to deliver his address. Then you'll get to have some lunch which will be served as the Treasurer is speaking, after which plenary group Sergio Calcareo will join the Treasurer on stage for discussion and audience questions. I would now like to welcome Darren Rogers to the stage.
Thanks, Andrew, and good afternoon. It is an absolute privilege to introduce the Queensland Treasurer, David Janetzki, to the budget address for CEDA, and APA is really delighted to be a major sponsor of the CEDA lunch today. Treasurer Janetzki made it really clear in his budget address last week that Queensland is really open for business, recognising that private sector investment really needs to underpin Queensland's economy. When Queensland is open for business, that means a collaboration between government, industry, academia and the community, and brings all of us together in this room. We know the Queensland Government is fostering collaboration in a strong way with business and industry. We know this as I was fortunate enough to represent APA in the Energy Sector Roundtable, convened by the Treasurer in his capacity as Energy Minister earlier this year, one of the many industry roundtables the Queensland Government have convened since taking office. It was clear then, and it remains really clear now, that the Treasurer understands the importance of bringing together a coalition of voices, including organisations like CEDA, to tackle the complex challenge of Queensland's energy ambitions and fiscal priorities head-on. At APA, this means continuing a strong partnership between industry and government. It's only by working together that we can drive sustained outcomes to support the future of all Queenslanders. APA has a long commitment to partner and it's steeped in our history. We have an enduring connection to Queensland dating back to 1969, when the then Premier Joh Bjelke-Petersen opened the Roma to Brisbane pipeline. It was a moment that really symbolised what can be done with government and industry working together with a shared purpose and with long-lasting benefits for a much broader community base. I truly would like to thank CEDA for putting on this important event and the role they play in pushing positive economic and social change for all Australians. So with that, I'm delighted to welcome the Treasurer, the Honourable David Janetzki, to the stage.
Thank you, Darren, for the kind introduction, and Andrew for your opening remarks as well. And I'm going to start my contribution today, and it is a privilege to be here for the first time as Treasurer at a post-budget lunch with CEDA, so thank you for the invitation. But I'm going to ask a question to start off with. What were you doing 25 years ago today? What were you doing? Think that through. And I reckon there's a few in the room that weren't even born. In fact, I know there's a couple in the room that weren't even born. But friends, 25 years ago today, Queenslanders, like most Australians, were waiting with some degree of anticipation. On this day, 25 years ago, Queenslanders were waiting upon the GST coming into effect the next day. Now, some of you may have a greater recollection of that than others, certainly those that weren't born, they would. But it was a momentous day in Australian history. It was the most significant tax reform in the nation's history, which promised to simplify the tax system and improve revenue collection for states and territories. It promised improved productivity by reducing tax system inefficiency and lowering compliance costs for business. But it was nevertheless a significant change to the status quo. And with that came some understandable apprehension about its introduction. A quarter of a century later, it's hard to argue against the reform, but it's not without its flaws, which is part of what I want to discuss with you today. But in order to convey the gravity of the challenges facing Queensland and by corollary, the consequences for national wealth and productivity, I need to share with you some details of the budget that I handed down last week, the Crisafulli government's first budget. And while most of that discussion will focus on revenue challenges, our budget also contains many positives that I'd like to briefly share with you before we return to the topics of GST and productivity. Our first budget, delivered last week, delivers the fresh start that we promised Queenslanders when they changed the government last year. It's a budget that honours our election commitments, and it's grounded in the principle of respecting taxpayers' money. It lays the foundation for budget repair to clean up a decade of the previous government's fiscal vandalism while saving the jobs and services that would have otherwise ended. We invested in the future of our state, education, community services, and the transport infrastructure Queenslanders need. And we locked in investments necessary to start addressing the youth crime, housing, health, cost of living crises we inherited from our predecessors. We're delivering targeted, responsible, and comprehensive cost of living relief to those who need it most, coupled with investments into long-term structural reform to put downward pressure on the cost of living. Long-term structural reform is fundamental to supporting improved living standards in Queensland. That's why we're increasing our electricity maintenance guarantee, which went from $1.4 billion to $1.6 billion in last week's budget, having already invested $450 million in 24-25 already. That helps us properly maintain our generation assets and helps put downward pressure on power bills over the long term. We're providing $37.5 million for free health checks for kids in kindy, and we've abolished the patients tax. That was the payroll tax on general practitioners operating under a contractor model, which will help put downward pressure on the cost of seeing the family doctor for vulnerable, sick and elderly Queenslanders. There's our new $100 back to school boost for primary age school kids to help kids, no matter where they may be starting primary school, whether it be public, Catholic or independent, to support them in their journey through primary school. And it's coupled with our $200 Play On school voucher program, which would have ended next week under the former government, but which we have locked in to the budget over the forwards. We've extended the first homeowner grant boost for a further 12 months to drive and incentivise young people to get into the housing market. These are all incentives that ignite supply through new build construction, because we've also abolished stamp duty for first home buyers purchasing a new build. But what I really want to spend a couple of minutes talking about is our nation-leading Boost to Buy scheme, which we talked about a lot last week during Budget Week. That is effectively our shared equity scheme, where the government will contribute 25% on an existing build and 30% on a new build to partner with first home buyers who may not have that great gift of parents who can support them with a deposit. So we're investing into that, and I've announced already that registration of interest is open, and I can actually inform you it's barely been promoted and we've already got over 1,000 registers of interest already in that program. So we want to drive home ownership in Queensland. We're currently at the bottom at 63.5%. The top of the country is at 71%. We are desperate to bring back hope for a generation of young Queenslanders that have given up hope, and that is the next stage for us with our Boost to Buy scheme. We've got our $2 billion residential activation fund, which is also a key part of building supply into the market. We all know that the housing crisis won't be addressed unless the supply problem is addressed. And that $2 billion residential activation fund, the Deputy Premier, he was out last night. There was a project in Logan that was on the news last night, for those who were watching the news last night. That's a significant project down in Logan that's going to open up potentially 20,000 lots over the medium and long term. That $2 billion fund, we've already got $1 billion that will be out the door to councils and developers by the 30th of June next year. So to have $1 billion of that out the door already, that will be a significant investment into that supply side that we must make. And half of that fund is actually allocated directly to the regions. I spend the rest of my week this week, from tonight onwards, out in regional Queensland, and we're determined that they get that support to invest into supply, because that housing crisis that we see obviously in the southeast corner, it's writ large across the entirety of the state, including in regional Queensland. So if we want to hit our target of 1 billion new homes by 2044, we have to do it right across the state. The budget also invests a record $5.6 billion in new social and community housing initiatives. and that's fundamental. We've got a community housing sector that wants to be more involved in the development and delivery of social and community homes, and we're going to give them every opportunity to get involved. We've also invested $5.2 billion to make our community safer, deliver stronger laws and consequences for action, more police, and a clear focus on rehabilitation and early intervention. We're delivering the single largest investment into Queensland's public schools in our state's history, including the construction of new schools and special schools. $29.4 billion in the budget for the health system. That's a 10.2% increase into the health system. We know we've got the worst ambulance ramping. We inherited it at 45%. We need to be driving that down, cutting surgical wait lists. We're going to make a capital investment into the hospital rescue plan of $18.5 billion. New hospitals across the state previously had been budgeted about $9 billion. Upon taking government, that had blown out to nearly double. We're investing into that capital program now to make sure that those hospitals are delivered, that they are delivered. This budget, we invested $5 billion into across the energy supply chain and transmission, distribution and generation. This includes copper string. In fact, my first budget announcement this budget was in Townsville, where we announced a record investment into the copper string project at $2.4 billion. Because we believe in the capability of the north and northwest Queensland, both in critical minerals for the Northwest Minerals Province, but also for the renewables projects, particularly with wind and solar around Hughenden and the potential and the opportunities that we see there. So we wanted to make that targeted investment into those kinds of projects. This budget's also delivering on our 2032 Olympic and Paralympic Games, which will deliver the largest infrastructure investment in Queensland's history. The first funding of the 2032 Games, we saw $950 million in there for the Athletes Village and $864 million for venues around the state. Obviously, we've made it clear that we need to rebuild confidence in the Olympic Games, and that meant introducing regional Queensland into the process. We need regional Queensland involved with the Games, partnering with the Southeast Corner to deliver a Games that all of Queensland can be proud of. There is no road in our state as integral to our prosperity as the Bruce Highway. And along with the Commonwealth, the Crisafulli government is investing $9 billion in the Bruce Highway to deliver long overdue safety upgrades. And we also want to keep investing into our tourism sector. So we've committed $446 million over 4 years towards delivering our Destination 2045 tourism plan, which will bring on 45 new ecotourism projects as well and helps position our tourism sector for not just the Games, but for the generation to follow. We're delivering on our election commitment that debt would be lower under the Crisafulli government than what it would have been under the former government. Total debt's now forecast to reach $205.7 billion at the end of the Fords. And under Labor, debt was forecast to reach $217.8 billion in 27-28, with a projection for 28-29 topping $250 billion. We are front-loading investments in jobs and services so that Queenslanders can reap the rewards sooner. We're front-loading those investments because we want to save those jobs and services while also delivering a long-term plan to fix the crises that were left behind. Doing so has pushed the budget into deficit of $8.6 billion in 25-26. Labor's consistent worsening deficits, including a forecast deficit of $9.2 billion in 27-28, are reversed now across the Ford estimates as we deliver consistent budget improvements, reducing the operating deficit forecast in 28-29 to $1.1 billion. The former government's deficits were later, longer and larger. This is a budget with no new or increased taxes, including one of the lowest standard payroll taxes in Australia, because it is beyond time that we restored taxation and regulatory certainty and stability to the Queensland economic landscape. And please, if your meals come, please start eating. Don't be put off by me speaking. We've got a stabilising fiscal position across the Fords. It's stabilising across the Fords. But the serious challenges we face will not be overcome in a single budget. It will take time, this term of government and the next. Returning to the budget to surplus has been made considerably harder by revenue headwinds. The former government collected more in coal royalties in 2 years than what we will collect in 4 years. But Labor's massive revenue windfall is gone. The revenue rivers of gold have been squandered. Equally significantly, Queensland's unprecedented GST reduction of $2.3 billion between last year and our first budget last week has punched a hole in revenue forecasts. And that brings me back to tomorrow's quarter-century anniversary. And I'm hoping some of you have cast your mind back now to what you were doing 25 years ago. Because milestones and milestone anniversaries are, of course, a time for reflection. The GST has always been subject to intense scrutiny and debate, especially when it comes to the annual carve-up and the pursuit of horizontal fiscal equalisation. For those unfamiliar with the basic principle of distributing the GST, each year the Commonwealth Grants Commission uses a complex methodology to distribute GST revenue. It attempts to ensure that each state has the same capacity to provide an equivalent standard of services to its residents, noting the varying characteristics of each state. Each year, the CGC makes recommendations to the Federal Treasurer, and every 5 years they review their methodology to ensure the balance is right. But over the years, the true ideal of equalisation has dwindled. From a series of perplexing methodology changes to the sweetheart deal for Western Australia, the carve-up is increasingly missing the mark. The most recent review resulted in significant changes to the distribution methods, including in the assessment of key service delivery expenses such as transport and health, and key state revenues such as coal and gas royalties. This has had a devastating impact on Queensland's revenue lines, $2.3 billion in 25-26 and $5.3 billion across the forward estimates. It's the largest redistribution in GST history. It's the largest redistribution away from a state in GST history. Meanwhile, every other state and territory gets a bigger share. Queensland's GST revenue in 25-26 is only 28% higher than what we received in 2015-16, 28%. In comparison, New South Wales, Victoria and Western Australia are up 58%, 118% and 317%. Almost every major decision made by the CGC this year was detrimental to Queensland. Digging into the detail, only half of the reduction was due to coal revenue. We were stripped of $800 million to reimburse New South Wales and Victoria for COVID-19 policy failures 5 years after the fact. Policy neutrality is supposed to be a key pillar of how the CGC makes its decisions. The GST distribution should not compensate states for any economic or financial mismanagement. But in practice, this doesn't occur. The CGC has assessed southern states as having no or limited ability to raise petroleum royalties, effectively gas royalties, despite those states having significant gas resources. However, specific and deliberate policy decisions by those jurisdictions have restricted their gas production with ideologically driven moratoriums. Queensland's sensible support of gas production has benefits beyond state borders and should not lead to a reduction in our share of the GST. The Yarra has nothing on our brown snake, yet buried in the CGC's mishmash of assessments is that Melbourne requires twice as much funding for ferries as Brisbane. Brisbane's annual ferry patronage tops $4 million compared to a negligible amount in Victoria. Brisbane is assessed as needing only a small fraction of the public transport infrastructure of Sydney and Melbourne simply because of Brisbane's lower population density, something which is driven by the necessary constraints on development given the city is built on a floodplain. The Commission's calculations embed a fundamental misunderstanding of the challenges of service delivery in a large decentralised state. They effectively assume that the cost of servicing a resident in Ballarat, 113 kilometres from Melbourne, is the same as someone being serviced from Brisbane to Mackay, which is 968 kilometres. Our state's unique challenge as the most decentralised population in the country and our support for sectors critical to the national interest demand true horizontal fiscal equalisation. Some of my interstate colleagues have called for a radical shift to a per capita split. While that would be simpler, it would entrench inequality and disadvantage. True horizontal fiscal equalisation is the only way, but we're far away from this at the moment. Proper horizontal fiscal equalisation should ensure all states have the financial capacity to provide equal standard of services to all Australians, regardless of where they may live. The alternative is a dampener on productivity and the industries that drive our national wealth. The industries that have the capacity to grow our GDP and the prosperity of our people. Thankfully, there is an opportunity for reform on the horizon. A Federal Productivity Commission review is due to start later this year. The previous review, initiated by the Turnbull government, was saddled with terms of reference which, in the words of Saul Eslake, and I'll quote, read as if they had been drafted by the Western Australia Treasury. It was used as a smokescreen for the WA Sweetheart deal. The next review cannot be used to lock in that deal, or worse, to lock in the deal while removing the no worse off guarantee top-up payments. Queensland has contributed to a fair and balanced terms of reference, which have now been submitted by the Board of Treasurers, the National Gathering of Treasurers, to the Federal Treasurer. If we are to have an informed national debate, it must be open and fair, not constrained with a predetermined outcome. And I don't say this simply as a spurned treasurer of a state with an inconvenient drop in GST revenue. I say it because it is essential for improved national productivity and prosperity. Now I'm going to turn to productivity. There's no secret that Queensland and indeed Australia are mired in productivity challenges, and it's something that CEDA has spent a great deal of time talking about and advocating on. Improving flatlining productivity was a priority of mine 5 years ago when I first became Shadow Treasurer. It remains a priority, and now I have an opportunity to do something about it, to squeeze more out of costly capital and scarce labour, to ensure our state's prosperity. Productivity is important because governments ultimately tax, spend and regulate. And the Federal Productivity Commission, in its 5-year review, was crying out for public policy improvements. Past Labor luminaries, Hawke and Keating, shaped their reform agendas on Productivity Commission recommendations. And I acknowledge the ambition of Federal Treasurer Jim Chalmers in this regard and the roundtable that he and the Prime Minister will shortly host. And I say we're here to help. Just as the approach to a fairer GST system needs to be driven by the states and developed in the national interest, the pursuit of economic reform to boost productivity, strengthen our resilience and improve budget sustainability must be advanced by state governments. States are at the front line of productivity reform. They pull the levers and push the controls that run the machinery of their respective economies. These in turn drive the national economy, and it's imperative that the states have a seat at the table. I'm putting forward the case that it should be me or our Premier which is at the table. Queensland, with its own newly re-established Productivity Commission, and I note that at least one of our productivity commissioners are here today. I see Karen, I'm not sure if Angela's here as well, but our newly re-established Productivity Commission is up and running, and we've made the first referral into the productivity of the building and construction sector, because there is no more sector fundamental to our economic future, particularly over the next 10 years and what is to come, than productivity in that sector. We are doing heavy lifting on productivity. Our gas is solving the southern states' energy crisis, and our GST revenue is helping Victoria keep their hospital lights on. As I said, the first order of business for our new Queensland Productivity Commission is a review into the construction and building sector and what productivity can be improved. Anecdotally, we've all heard it. Productivity on work sites around Queensland, maybe 2.7, 2.8 business days a week. That isn't going to get built what needs to be built. So that is why the first referral is to that Productivity Commission. Our second referral is seeking the Productivity Commission's advice with respect to productivity in the energy sector. And I acknowledge many in the room today have a strong interest in our energy sector, including Darren, who introduced me. We want to make sure that we are getting productivity driven through that as we continue to develop our energy roadmap, which will be delivered by the end of this year. A future target for our Productivity Commission will be microeconomic reform, and that includes better regulation, fit-for-purpose regulation, and cutting red tape where possible. Shortly before the abolition of the former Productivity Commission, in fact, the last review that the Productivity Commission undertook was a review into Queensland's regulatory environment. It's one of those areas that I always remember, because in a former life I was responsible for maintaining our regulatory obligation register, and there was an audit in 2013 on Queensland's regulatory obligations, and back in 2013 that audit revealed there were 265,000 regulatory obligations on the statute and regulatory books of Queensland. Now let me tell you, the last 10 years, the last dozen years, governments have not stopped, or the former government has not stopped, increasing burden, regulatory burden, on what you are trying to achieve. So we've now got a significant impost on that cost of regulatory burden to business. In fact, roughly $3.5 to $7 billion each year alone on compliance costs. It costs between 2.6 and 3.1 billion to manage those regulatory burdens, administering and enforcing. I don't think there's any doubt that the case for reform is irresistible. And we're serious about supporting the Commonwealth's efforts in driving productivity to deliver sustained improvements in living standards. And if delivering meaningful and measurable economic reform means Queensland gets a slice of the incentive payments on the table from the federal government, so that's a federal government fund, roughly $900 million in that federal government fund seeking to drive productivity. Queensland's allocation is roughly $170 million of that fund. I want to make sure that Queensland drains every last cent we can from that productivity fund to help us in our aspiration to deliver better productivity here in Queensland. Now, in an era of challenging government debt and challenging government balance sheets, deliberate deployment of diverse capital has never been more important. We've laid the foundation for budget repair while supporting the jobs, services and projects that Queenslanders deserve. And to this end, today, I can announce that I've tasked Queensland Treasury to establish a dedicated unit to attract private capital to help deliver infrastructure projects needed for a growing state. And we're going to call it Treasury's Transaction Team. It will be up and running by the 1st of August. To explore different models to deliver commercially for investors while delivering for taxpayers. And I'm going to take this opportunity. I've got plenty of my Treasury team here today, and they'll be dotted around tables. I'm going to say it publicly again, the astounding work that Treasury undertook under the leadership of our Under-Treasurer Paul, the amount of work that Treasury undertook in helping us to prepare for the budget. It was a budget that we took very seriously. It was our first budget, first Liberal National budget in a dozen years, and we took it very seriously, line by line. We're very calm and methodical, serious and sober, targeted and responsible. We took it very seriously, and that would not have been possible without the astounding and amazing support from Paul and his Treasury team. So to everyone from Treasury who's here today, I want to give a big shout out to all of you for everything that you did in helping us deliver the budget. And we are committed. You've heard us say it before a lot, particularly the Premier, talk about an empowered and powerful public service. You know, we need a public service that is absolutely at its capacity to deliver more and better services in service to the Queensland people. So we are absolutely right behind our public service, and I thank Treasury. And my hope for this team is that it absolutely helps us focus on what Treasury can deliver, because we need private capital. The Deputy Premier has told me we've got over 200 expressions of interest already into the Gabba precinct from private investors, people that want to get involved with what is happening in Queensland, that we are sending a very clear open for business message. And whether that be the Gabba precinct, with the arena, with the games stadium, or whether any infrastructure across the state, we are sending a very clear message that we are open for business. And the Deputy Premier is running those processes, but in Treasury, with this new Treasury transaction team, we are wanting to send a clear message that we are open for business and that we have the capability to deliver it. It's a next step in my, what I want to see Treasury involved with, right? And my professional background, I want to make sure that we are leaning into the private sector, leaning into philanthropy, leaning into the community sector to deliver what we want and need and the state needs. So I've set up a Office of Social Impact because I think government needs to partner with the philanthropic sector and the community sector. I want to see that kind of engagement right across the government, wherever it may be. Because we all know, you all know it in your businesses, you all know it wherever you may travel, that well-directed and efficient capital investment ultimately reduces operating costs over time. And it's important that capital is directed where it needs to go. We know capital goes where it's welcome and stays where it's needed. Well, it's welcome here and it's sorely needed. And the Crisafulli government will continue to do all we can to show how important it is to us. Friends, I'm going to finish with my 25-year theme. Just as the GST was a catalyst for improved productivity 25 years ago, there is much to be gained from the rising national collective will to drive productivity. But in order to deliver this productivity promise, the GST's intended benefits to states needs to be reimagined. Reshaping our economic architecture in service of the nation and ultimately the Queensland people will take time and persistence, but it is fundamental to our future. It must be guided by the desire to improve productivity, not just for the benefit of a magnificent state, but for the good of our nation. And to get there, we needed the fresh start that the Crisafulli government's first budget delivered last week. It's a long journey ahead, but we can now say with certainty that we have taken the first step. Thank you.